You hear all about the disasters, but the survivors' lives go on for years and years after the headlines fade. These are their remarkable stories.
Calling a ship unsinkable is just daring the universe to prove otherwise, and that's exactly what happened when the Titanic sank on April 14, 1912. On board was 2-month-old Melvina Dean, who would become the last surviving passenger. Dean, her parents, and her brother were emigrating to the U.S. from England. Their final destination was Kansas City, but they never got there. Although she, her brother, and her mother were among the first passengers who made it into the lifeboats, her father stayed behind and was one of the many who died in the freezing waters. She became something of a celebrity in her later years, but Dean refused to see any film version of the sinking, especially James Cameron's.
I wouldn't see the film because of my father going down. I wondered if he was going down with the ship. I couldn't see that. It would be too emotional.
Still, in 2009, when she was struggling to pay for her nursing home, Cameron, Leonardo DiCaprio, and Kate Winslet sent along a hefty donation to ensure her future. Dean was 97 years old when she passed away later that year. It was David Dushman who drove his tank straight through the Auschwitz electric fence. He and his fellow soldiers had no idea what the camp was and what horrors were about to unfold before them. When he passed away in 2021, that left only a single surviving soldier from the first group to liberate the Nazis' most notorious concentration camp. Ivan Martinushkin was just 21 years old when he accompanied the Red Army's 322nd Rifle Division into what they first thought was an empty camp, until they saw some of the 7,000-odd prisoners who had been left behind after the Nazi evacuation. He spoke openly about what they found there, recalling, "We saw emaciated, tortured, impoverished people. Those were the people I first encountered. We could tell from their eyes that they were happy to be saved from this hell, happy that now they weren't threatened by death in a crematorium, happy to be freed." He has also said that he was well aware at the time that he was looking at the fate he could have shared. Around 15,000 of his fellow Soviet soldiers had died at Auschwitz, with hundreds dying in the days just before the liberators arrived. And that indiscriminate killing is at the heart of the message that he continued to spread even after he became the last living liberator of the Auschwitz concentration camp. The life of entire peoples were put at stake. It probably didn't seem like much of a historic event at the time, but when Gordon Moore and 7 of his co-workers at the Shockley Semiconductor Laboratory quit to form their own company, it was the moment that kickstarted Silicon Valley and, in turn, laid the groundwork for today's computer age.
In the absence of an official contract, 8 newly minted dollar bills were passed around the table for signatures.
Moore became the last survivor of the so-called Traitorous Eight after the 2021 death of Dr. J. Last. After Last, Moore and their colleagues parted ways with a notoriously difficult-to-work-with Nobel Prize-winning Dr. William Shockley. They founded Fairchild Semiconductor, developed a method for building silicon chips quickly and efficiently, and the world never looked back. Silicon Valley sprang up around Fairchild Semiconductor, and it's nice to imagine that Shockley was left shaking his fist at them with pure rage. Moore went on to co-found Intel and established the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, which gives away $300 million in charitable donations every year. Meanwhile, Moore's Law, the prediction that the processing power of computers was going to double every year, has proved pretty accurate, and it might not have happened if Moore and his colleagues hadn't made the historic decision to quit their jobs and set out on their own. He died in March 2023 at the age of 94. The days of gathering the family around the radio to listen to a story unfold have been replaced by Netflix and podcasts, but in 1938, one radio drama went down in history. War of the Worlds went out across national airwaves in October that year. There's quite a bit of debate about whether or not it actually caused any kind of panic, with many experts saying that it didn't, and those stories were a bit of folklore added later. That's impressive in and of itself, and surprisingly, the last member of that broadcast lived to see the reports of hysteria and various remakes of the story. When Bill Hurs died in 2016, the New York Times described him as, quote, something of a curmudgeon. In addition to working for Orson Welles as casting director, Hurs voiced several roles in the radio drama as well. His 2 ham radio operators talking about the alien invasion they were witnessing made it into the final broadcast. And during rehearsals, he also stood in for Welles. He wasn't shy about saying just what he thought about the now famous broadcast either. I thought to myself, nobody's going to believe this in a million years. Boy, was I wrong. In 2014, the New York Times reported on the death of the last man to have a bird's-eye view of the event that would change not just the course of World War II, but modern warfare. Theodore Van Kirk was a navigator on the Enola Gay. At 93 years old, he was the last survivor of the crew that dropped the atomic bomb in Hiroshima. According to the atomic physicists on site, there were just 43 seconds between the release of the bomb and its impact.
And he looked at us and said, "We think the airplane will be okay if you're 9 miles away when the bomb explodes."
As Van Kirk recalled, the plane jumped and made a sound like sheet metal snapping. Shortly after the second wave, we turned to where we could look out and see the cloud, where the city of Hiroshima had been. I describe it looking like a pot of black boiling tar. He also spoke of the moments immediately following the blast, when he had the sense that something world-changing had just happened. He also realized that their small crew were, for a few short moments, the only ones on Earth who knew what had just been done. Van Kirk left the military in 1946. After earning a master's in chemical engineering and spending 35 years working for DuPont, he later gave lectures on his role in World War II. He always said that he did it to educate the following generations on what had happened that day, and he always stood by the decision to drop the bombs. There are plenty of historic events that are downright awful, including the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. The study involved 623 black men who were monitored over the course of 4 decades. Some were diagnosed with syphilis, some were not, and they were all under the impression that they were being treated for other ailments that included things like fatigue and anemia. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention says the men were not honestly informed of what the study was, nor was consent given. Worse, even when treatments for syphilis became available, the test subjects weren't treated. The last surviving participant was Ernest Hendon, who passed away in 2004 at the age of 96. According to the Los Angeles Times, Hendon and his brother were both a part of the control group that didn't have syphilis, and he spoke about how they had no idea what they were actually signing up for, recalling, "They said it was a study that would do you good." Hendon outlived scores of other participants. When the story went public in 1972, 100 men were dead of complications linked to their participation. 28 were dead from syphilis, and since they hadn't been told what they had, at least 59 wives and children were also diagnosed with the disease. Hendon lived to hear President Bill Clinton's apology, stating, "Everybody knows now that we were mistreated. I'm glad they're seeing now that it will never happen again." It was probably unbelievably exciting for an 8-year-old boy. Werner Donner was going to be one of the passengers on an airship touted as a huge flying billboard for German aeronautical supremacy. It came complete with swastikas, had already made 62 perfectly safe and uneventful journeys, and when Donner and his family boarded in 1937, it was traveling from Frankfurt, Germany all the way to Lakehurst, New Jersey. The airship was, of course, the Hindenburg, and it was about 175 feet in the air when fire engulfed the airship in about 34 seconds.
This is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world. Oh, for humanity.
Donner's quick-thinking mother pushed both him and his brother out a window before she jumped, and although they spent weeks in the hospital with severe burns, it saved their lives. Donner's father and sister weren't as fortunate, and both perished. His mother had tried to save his sister too, but had been unable to lift her out of the Zeppelin window, and the last time he saw his father, he just recorded some video and was heading back to their cabin. Donner died in 2019 at the age of 90, but his son Bernie said, "My dad was secretive about the disaster and didn't like to talk about it. He was a really private person." It's no secret that working conditions throughout history have often been pretty terrible. That was brought into sharp relief in 1911 when New York City's Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was consumed in a fiery blaze that killed 146 of the 600 factory employees there that day. The fire brought national attention to the dangers of sweatshops, particularly because it was determined that most of the deaths would have been preventable if only basic safety measures had been observed. The deaths were gruesome. Many were burned alive or died jumping out of the factory's windows. Rose Friedman was one of the lucky ones. The 17-year-old went up instead of down, following company execs who were heading to the roof to be rescued. She was rescued too, and went on to become an outspoken campaigner in the fight for employee rights, labor unions, and an overhaul to the national worker safety legislation. She loudly condemned the execs she'd followed to the roof, revealing that they'd locked the doors because they had been afraid of theft and had tried to bribe her to say otherwise. At the time of her death in 2001, Friedman was the last living survivor of the fire. She was 107 years old. Clarence Norris was the last surviving defendant in a case that became a landmark example of racial injustice in America. He was a member of the so-called Scottsboro Boys, a group of 9 black men between the ages of 13 and 19 who were accused of raping 2 white women in Alabama. The boys had been on a train heading north for work when they were arrested near Scottsboro. The arrest came in 1931, but the case dragged on until 1937, and even though one of the accusers recanted, Norris was given the death penalty 3 times. He wasn't fully or formally exonerated until 1976. He was paroled in 1946, but the stigma remained. Norris fought it, saying, "A man should never give up hope. They had said that I was a nobody, a dog, but I stood up and I said the truth. Somebody's got to do these things in life." Norris was 76 years old when he died in 1989. It took until 2013 for 3 of the men, Haywood Patterson, Charles Weems, and Andy Wright, to receive their formal exonerations long after their deaths. The Christmas truce is one of the most famous stories of World War I. It happened on December 25, 1914, when soldiers on opposing sides silenced their weapons and emerged from the trenches. Face to face with enemy soldiers who were just like they were, young men sent into a terrifying war, they traded gifts, sang Christmas carols, and even played impromptu games of soccer.
It's a victory, the likes of which will not be seen again.
The last surviving witness to the Christmas truce was Alfred Anderson. He had been 18 years old at the time, and when he died in 2005, he'd reached the ripe old age of 109. Anderson served with the Black Watch Regiment and spoke of the experience, saying, "All I'd heard for 2 months in the trenches was the hissing, cracking, and whining of bullets in flight, machine gun fire, and distant German voices. But there was a dead silence that morning. We shouted Merry Christmas, even though nobody felt merry. The silence ended early in the afternoon, and the killing started again." Anderson was also the final survivor of a group of soldiers who took their name from a comment made by Kaiser Wilhelm II. They were the Old Contemptibles, and Anderson served on the front lines until he was severely wounded in the spring of 1916. He was sent back to England to become an instructor, and he never left the UK again. The famous Iditarod sled dog race covers a 1,100-mile route from Anchorage to Nome, and although it only started in 1973, it was inspired by an event from decades earlier. Back then, however, the relay teams were working against much higher stakes, life and death. It was 1925, and the highly contagious disease diphtheria had broken out in Nome, Alaska. Life-saving serum was sourced from Anchorage, but it was the middle of the winter, and after getting it part of the way by train, the planes intended for the final leg of the journey were deemed unflyable.
These are aircraft that are built out of wood and fabric and basically piano wire.
Answer: man and man's best friend. It took a relay of 20 men and 150 dogs to get the serum to Nome, but they did it, and the last surviving member of that group of fearless men passed away in 1999. Edgar Nollner was the second in the relay team. At the time he set out, it was already 56 degrees below zero. Still, he and his team covered 24 miles up the Yukon River in just around 3 hours. Other teams suffered catastrophic consequences. Dogs died and froze in their harnesses, and mushers suffered severe frostbite and temporary blindness. The extreme conditions meant that there was a series of close calls, but as retold in the movie Balto, the serum made it in time to save hundreds of lives. Nollner passed away after suffering heart failure at the age of 94. Train robberies might seem like something that's been left behind in the Old West, but nobody told the 15 men who in 1963 hijacked a train, pulling off the largest cash heist in world history. The caper is widely known as the Great Train Robbery. The thieves not only made off with £2.6 million from a British postal train, but they became international celebrities for basically giving the establishment the middle finger at a time when the majority of the world was struggling. Adjust that £2.6 million for inflation, and by 2022, that's about £58 million. The entire thing was orchestrated with help from a still unidentified inside man known only as the Ulsterman. After the robbery, the 15 thieves went their separate ways. Some fled the country, some were arrested, and one was killed by a hitman. The last survivor is Bobby Welch. Welch was sentenced to 30 years in prison. He was released on June 14, 1976, and apparently managed to find the person who'd been in charge of his share of the cash while he was away. The deaths of all the other robbers meant it's unlikely that the mysteries surrounding the robbery will ever be solved. It's no secret that World War II was full of unspeakable horrors, and that was definitely true of combat in the Pacific. Even after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan was in doubt as to whether or not they wanted to bring the war to an end, all the way up until the documents were signed. But in a September 2, 1945 ceremony on board the USS Missouri, U.S. General Douglas MacArthur accepted Japan's surrender. The deck of the ship was lined with witnesses, and the very last surviving American who was there to see it passed away in 2019. At the time of the surrender, he was still Lieutenant Commander Robert Kenneth Kaufman, and he served at the ceremony as an aide and flag lieutenant. Kaufman would go on to earn the rank of captain, and by the time he was front and center for the surrender, he'd already served in the North Atlantic and North Africa. After his retirement, Kaufman continued to participate in remembrance events. When he laid the wreath at the 2017 Pearl Harbor Remembrance Day, he was already the sole survivor of the witnesses to Japan's surrender. If there were any Americans who were still on the fence about getting involved in World War I, they almost certainly had a change of heart on May 7, 1915. That's the day a German U-boat targeted and sank the passenger liner Lusitania, killing 1,198 of the 2,000 people on board, including more than 100 Americans.
At 2:28, just 18 minutes after she was struck, the Lusitania disappears.
The last known survivor was Audrey Lawson Johnston, who passed away in 2011 at the age of 95. She was just 3 months old when she sailed aboard the doomed passenger liner and owed her life to a nursemaid who was traveling with the family. It was 18-year-old Alice Lines who made sure she and her brother made it to a lifeboat. It wasn't easy. Lines would later testify that she had initially been pushed away from the lifeboats but jumped into the water to follow her young charges. Lines and the two children were soon reunited with their parents, Warren and Amy Pearl. Tragically, their 2 other daughters and their nurse were lost in the disaster. Their bodies were never recovered. Lawson Johnston made her thoughts on the sinking clear, stating, I never blamed the sea because it wasn't the sea's fault. It was the Germans' fault, and that was that. While scores of people visit the memorials to the World War II bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there aren't nearly as many who visit the 94-foot fishing boat that is Daigo Fukuryo Maru, or Lucky Dragon. Perhaps that's because they don't realize that what happened to the boat and the 23-member crew was so terrible that it, not the aforementioned Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, kicked off a worldwide movement to ban atomic weapons.
Deadly ashes were found all over the ship and strong radioactivity. What would the experts say now?
It was March 1st, 1954, when the little fishing boat was caught in the fallout from the United States Castle Bravo tests of a new thermonuclear device. The boat was 86 miles away from the test site, but was still caught in the ash rains that fell afterward and lasted for 5 hours. All the men on the ship were hospitalized, suffering from bloody sores and blisters, hair loss, and damage that will haunt them for the rest of their lives. The last survivor of the ill-fated Lucky Dragon was Matashichi Oishi, who passed away in 2021, 67 years after he was caught in Castle Bravo's fallout. Oishi, who wrote a book about his experience, struggled with health problems his entire life. He was diagnosed with liver cancer, sleeping sickness, and hepatitis C. Although he always knew what the cause was, he fought for 5 decades to be given status as a victim of a nuclear bomb. He also blames his lasting health problems for the stillbirth of his child. Technically, World War II came to an end several times, and Germany alone actually surrendered twice. The first surrender happened on May 7, 1945, and the second occurred on May 9. The first was signed in Reims, France, and the second, done at the behest of Stalin and the Soviets, happened in Berlin. The first was attended by then 22-year-old Luciano Graziano, who became the last surviving witness. With time, he realized just how significant it was, later writing, "I was honored to be in that room that day." Drafted out of his sister's beauty parlor in East Aurora, New York, where he did everything from haircuts to perms, he was assigned to a unit tasked with keeping Allied buildings up and running. After hitting Omaha Beach in the third wave on D-Day, he participated in the Battle of the Bulge and was serving as utilities foreman when he was asked to oversee the outfitting of the Little Red Schoolhouse for surrender. After the war, he opened a salon in Georgia. His daughters now oversee the business, and he has since written a book titled A Patriot's Memoirs of World War II, through my eyes, heart, and soul about his experiences in the war.
But what if a tornado, an F5 tornado, were to appear out of nowhere, with no warning at all?
Well, it happened. On April 5th, 1936, Tupelo, Mississippi endured one of the deadliest weather events in United States history. The Tupelo tornado killed more than 200 people, and it was just one element of a storm system that tore across the southeast over 2 days, beginning in Arkansas. When the storm hit Tupelo, it left 11 people dead on the town outskirts before moving downtown and into the surrounding neighborhoods. In addition to leaving at least 216 people dead, more than 1,000 people may have been injured. If you're not familiar with the Fujita scale used to classify tornadoes and their damage, the scale goes from F0 to F5, with F5 being the most severe. This one hit the top of the scale. Elvis Presley was born in Tupelo, Mississippi, and spent the first 15 years of his life there. When the Tupelo tornado struck in 1936, Presley was only 15 months old, and he and his family waited out the storm at the home of his great-uncle. Somewhere around 48 blocks were completely destroyed. Fortunately, the Presley family home suffered no damage at all. In September 2008, Travis DJ AM played a free show at the University of South Carolina in Columbia. The ex-primary members were Blink-182 drummer Travis Barker and DJ AM, or Adam Goldstein. After the show, the musicians boarded a small plane to head back to California, but just after takeoff, the plane overshot the runway and crashed into a wall, bursting into flames.
The plane was completely on fire. We were a ball of fire in the sky.
4 passengers died immediately, but Goldstein and Barker survived. Barker escaped the fiery wreckage through an emergency exit, but just barely. He told Joe Rogan, "I jumped right into the jet, which is full of fuel. My whole body lit up. I had jet fuel on my whole body." The survivors were rushed to the Joseph M. Still Burn Center in Augusta, Georgia in critical condition. Barker was burned over 2/3 of his body. It took 26 surgeries, multiple skin grafts, and 3 months of recovery and physical therapy before he could properly walk again. Before the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and the United States formally entered World War II, 24-year-old John F. Kennedy joined the U.S. Navy. He was promoted to the rank of lieutenant junior grade and assigned to command a PT boat, a long, fast torpedo-equipped watercraft deployed on patrols and also in battle. Lieutenant Kennedy assumed command of PT-109 in April 1943 and was one of several sent to assist the invasion of New Georgia and the Solomon Islands, a skirmish in the Pacific Theater. Their mission was to harass Japanese supply ships, but on the evening of August 1st, a Japanese destroyer opened fire and tore Kennedy's boat in half. 2 crewmen were never seen again, several others were severely injured, and the survivors were left stranded with the burning wreck and the nearest land more than 3 miles away. Kennedy swam for 3 hours, gathering his surviving men together onto the wreckage. One of those, engineer Patrick McMahon, had suffered life-threatening burns. The following day, the wreckage began to sink.
They're drifting, holding onto the hull and drifting in the water when he sees a group of islands about 3 miles off.
That's when Kennedy decided they would swim for shore. He personally saved McMahon by holding the strap of his life vest in his teeth as he swam. You know Yogi Berra. He played for the New York Yankees for 18 seasons, won 10 World Series championships, and was named American League MVP 3 times. His career may have lasted longer. Berra was playing minor league ball in 1943, but he didn't appear in the Yankees uniform until 1946 because he joined the U.S. Navy at the peak of combat operations during World War II. On June 6, 1944, 150,000 troops representing the Allied nations of the US, UK, Canada, Norway, and Free France stormed the beaches of Normandy in an operation that turned the tide of the war for the Allies. 19-year-old Berra was one of 6 members in the Navy selected and trained to operate a seafaring craft armed with rockets and machine guns that would ultimately be one of the first to arrive on the beaches of D-Day. Berra fired at and took out German machine gunners on shore to provide safe passage for the thousands of troops running and on foot behind him. It was an extraordinarily dangerous mission, and while successful, it resulted in significant losses. More than 12,000 Allied individuals died, were injured, or were captured. But not Berra. He survived to take part in a similar Navy-powered drive to free southern France later in 1944. If you've ever wondered what happened to the hair metal bands of the 1980s, the answer is often that they just kept touring, playing smaller and smaller venues, like the station in West Warwick, Rhode Island. On February 20th, 2003, the station hosted Great White, or at least a partial reunion of the original Great White, dubbed Jack Russell's Great White, and more than 400 fans showed up. As the band began to play, the tour manager set off pyrotechnics, despite being expressly told not to do so due to the danger of using fire in such an enclosed space. Within seconds, the club erupted in flames.
Before you knew it, the lights went out, and it was all over.
Russell tried to douse the fire by pouring cups of water on it, which did nothing. He and the rest of the band managed to escape the venue through a stage door. Meanwhile, the 400 people inside panicked as the fire raged, exploding beams, the roof, and liquor bottles in the bar. 2 of the exits had been barricaded, leading to a crush of people at the single main entrance, trapping them in the inferno. In the documentary America's Deadliest Concert, The Guest List, Russell reflected, "I know what happened, and I'm not going to put the blame on anybody. It was just a horrible, horrible tragedy, and I wish I could go back and cancel that show." The fire killed 100 people that night. Interior designer Nate Berkus has hosted his own daytime talk show as well as a number of other HGTV programs, and has his name on several different product lines. But the moment Berkus's career took off was bittersweet, and it followed a horrific personal tragedy. What became known as the Boxing Day tsunami began just before 8 a.m. on December 26, 2004, when one of the strongest earthquakes ever recorded, hitting 9.1 on the Richter scale, rumbled below the Indian Ocean. The quake set off violent tidal waves, some moving as fast as 500 miles per hour. Banda Aceh, a city on the Indonesian island of Sumatra, was buried, killing 100,000 people. In Thailand, 5,400 people lost their lives. Resorts and tourist spots throughout Southeast Asia were devastated, including Arugam Bay in Sri Lanka. That's where Berkus and his partner, photographic artist Fernando Bengoechea, were vacationing. Bengoechea is believed to have been swept out to sea and drowned, but his body was never recovered.
I believe that I survived this tsunami so that I would be able to understand how Fernando died.
Miraculously, Berkus survived with only superficial injuries. Speaking with People, he shared, "I had scars. I have scars still, not extensive, but if you know, you know." Another big name who survived the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami was action movie superstar Jet Li. On the day of the tsunami, Li was at the Four Seasons in the Maldives. It wasn't Li's first earthquake, so when he felt the tremors, he wasn't alarmed. He went about his day, taking his daughters to the beach about 2 hours later. Speaking with Newsweek, Li recalled, "We were just outside the hotel, by the pool and slightly above the beach, when I saw the water come. Li and the nanny each grabbed a child and ran for the hotel, but found themselves underwater after a few steps." Li remembered, "I turned back and everything, the beach, the swimming pool, was gone." Li called out for help and 4 men pulled the group to safety. One of the most powerful first ladies in U.S. history, Eleanor Roosevelt held the position longer than any other FLOTUS, from 1933 to 1945. Both of Roosevelt's parents were members of prominent political families. Her father was Theodore Roosevelt's brother, and her mother was linked to the Livingstons. Her social status meant Roosevelt was used to the high life. On May 19, 1887, 2-year-old Eleanor and her parents were on board the White Star ocean liner SS Britannic. The ship had just left port in New York City, headed for Liverpool, England. More than 300 miles off the coast of New Jersey, the Britannic was pushing through dense fog when it was hit by another White Star liner, the Celtic. The two ships collided at a particularly violent near right angle. The sharp bow of the Celtic plunged 10 feet into the side of the Britannic. The impact immediately killed 6 people in the steerage section of the Britannic, while another 6 fell into the sea and were presumed dead. Young Eleanor was among the ship's survivors, but she reportedly developed a lifelong fear of water from that point on. Charles Nelson Riley was a legend on Match Game, but he was also a Broadway legend. He won a Tony for acting in the 1961 musical How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying. When he was 13 years old, Riley was among the estimated 6,000 to 8,000 audience members gathered under the Big Top to see a performance of the Ringling Brothers' Barnum and Bailey Circus on Barber Street in Hartford, Connecticut. As the Great Wallendas began their legendary trapeze act, a fire broke out, likely caused by a smoldering cigarette butt. The surface quickly became engulfed in flames, fueled by the extremely flammable paraffin wax and gasoline used for waterproofing. Screaming patrons rushed for the exits, but many were blocked by animal cages. Chunks of flaming canvas fell onto the crowd as they pushed and tore their way to safety. In under 10 minutes, the entire Big Top was destroyed and 170 people had been killed by a combination of fire, smoke, and stampede. Riley managed to survive, but for the rest of his life, he had difficulty being in crowds of people. As a teenager in 1967, Alex Chilton scored a #1 hit, The Letter, with the Box Tops. When the group split up, Chilton moved on to Big Star, an influential band who never managed to sell a lot of albums. Big Star broke up after just 4 years, and in 1982, Chilton, tired of being jerked around by the music industry, left his hometown of Memphis to start over in New Orleans. While playing in bar bands and working a string of regular guy jobs, Chilton saved enough money to buy a weathered 19th century Creole cottage in the Treme neighborhood. When Hurricane Katrina pummeled New Orleans in August 2005, Treme was hit hard by floodwaters and high winds. In total, the disaster was responsible for $81 billion worth of damages to the city. Many residents lost their homes and 1,500 people died.
This is what's left. You know, your whole history is just somewhere under a pile of rubble.
Chilton's home suffered the wrath of the hurricane, and he very nearly lost his life. The raised structure didn't flood, but its outer walls barely withstood the storm's high winds. Still, Chilton refused to evacuate, nailing boards to the windows and sheltering in place, without power or cell service, fearful of looters. After 5 terrifying days, feeling abandoned and running out of food, Chilton climbed onto his roof and waved his arms until he attracted the attention of a helicopter, which airlifted him to safety. Another figure in American music history who survived the devastation of Hurricane Katrina was Fats Domino. Domino was a pioneer of the New Orleans school of R&B that helped form the basis for early rock and roll. The notoriously shy Domino was born and spent his life in New Orleans. When the lower Ninth Ward began to flood, he refused to evacuate. He stayed behind to watch over his ailing wife, Rosemary. For days, Domino's friends and relatives weren't able to reach him. He was even presumed dead after media outlets captured a message scrawled on the musician's home reading, "R.I.P. Fats, you will be missed." Hours after Domino's supposed death began to hit the news, CNN confirmed that he'd been pulled out of the second floor of his flooded home by a Coast Guard helicopter. The Beverly Hills Supper Club, a cabaret-style nightclub outside Cincinnati, drew huge crowds with its slate of dinner, cocktails, and major acts.
Once you got into your chair, you couldn't get out. That's how close they packed them in for the show.
That's obviously a bad thing if something goes wrong. On May 28, 1977, 1,200 people, double the capacity of the entire venue, packed into the club's cabaret room to see John Davidson, a Broadway star, crooner, and host of The John Davidson Show. The opening act was a pair of ventriloquists, Teeter and McDonald. As they took the stage, an electrical fire began in the empty Zebra Room, spreading noxious fumes and smoke into the cabaret room.
It built up so much heat that the room and all its furnishings literally exploded into flames.
A busboy interrupted the ventriloquist to urge the audience to evacuate. The crowd thought it was part of the show, even going so far as to laugh at him. Those who did try to get out struggled to do so in the packed room. Davidson helped evacuate the room by holding open an out-of-the-way back door entrance.
I was one of the lucky ones that got out through a door that was just put in the year before.
Not everyone was so lucky. Davidson's musical director died in the fire, and he was called to identify the body at an emergency morgue set up at a nearby gymnasium.
Changed my life and changed so many lives. It made me reevaluate the value of life and how fragile we all are.
While Davidson did help save lives that night, many fans were trapped inside the room as it filled with fire and smoke. All told, 165 people died in the fire. A little after 3 p.m. on August 28, 1990, a tornado registering at the maximum level of F5 hit the Chicago suburb of Plainfield, Illinois. Wind speeds were estimated to be 318 miles per hour. In just 30 minutes' time, the twister created a path of destruction 16.4 miles long and as much as half a mile wide.
It was the most powerful August tornado to ever strike the United States.
It killed 29 people, injured 350 more, and left behind $160 million in property damage. About 1,000 homes were damaged, and 470 were completely destroyed. Future movie star Melissa McCarthy was raised in Plainfield, and she was home from college that weekend to see her parents and friends. She was hanging out with a friend at a townhouse when the tornado hit. On an episode of Hot Ones, McCarthy recalled, "We were sitting on the couch in front of patio windows. I don't remember what happened, but I think it must have been a pressure change, and I just remember him grabbing me really roughly and jerking me by the shirt, and we went toward his basement stairs." When they ascended the stairs, they discovered that the windows had all been blown out, the top level of the home had been torn away by the tornado, and the entire block of townhouses had been destroyed. From 1965 to 1971, Robert Clary co-starred on the sitcom Hogan's Heroes as Corporal Louis LeBeau. That very dark premise somehow fueled a lot of comedy, offering a lighthearted view of the horrific setting Clary had endured in real life 2 decades earlier. Clary was also French, and as a teenager, he and the other Jewish residents of Paris were arrested when the Nazis occupied the city after the Battle of France.
We were not allowed to be in show business. We were not allowed to be in the street after 8 p.m.
Clary was sent to a slave labor camp in Germany where he was forced to make shoes, while Allied air raids frequently bombed the facility. He also survived the Nazi death camp Buchenwald, where around 56,000 people, primarily Jews, were systematically killed. Clary's talent is what enabled his survival. He was a gifted singer and accordion player, and while in the camp, Nazi officers and guards forced him to perform for them. Years later, he told The Hollywood Reporter, "Singing, entertaining, and being in kind of good health at my age, that's why I survived." Near the end of the war, Clary was among the contingent of 4,000 surviving Nazi prisoners forced to participate in a death march of several hundred miles. Along the way, 2,500 people perished. The story of legendary soul singer-songwriter Otis Redding is forever linked to that of his explosive backing band, the Bar-Kays. Part of the burgeoning Memphis soul scene, the Bar-Kays formed in 1964 as an instrumental act and studio collective, including a guitarist and drummer, an organist, and a horn section. In 1966, when Redding's career started to take off with hits like Respect and Try a Little Tenderness, he needed a solid band to back him up. So in 1967, he hired the Bar-Kays. On December 9, 1967, 2 days after he recorded what would become his signature tune, Sitting on the Dock of the Bay, Redding and the Bar-Kays headed to a studio in Cleveland to tape a performance on the nationally broadcast music show Upbeat, then boarded Redding's newly purchased private plane to jet to the next gig. But just 4 miles from the Madison Municipal Airport in Wisconsin, the plane malfunctioned and crashed into Lake Monona. Redding, who was just 26 years old, died in the crash along with the flight crew, a road manager, and 4 members of the Bar-Kays. The only survivor of the accident was the band's trumpet player, Ben Cawley. One other member of the band survived. Bass player James Alexander wasn't on the plane. He opted to take a different flight to Madison. London stage star Betsy Drake was headed for the United States on board the ocean liner Queen Mary in 1947, where she spent much of the voyage rebuffing the romantic advances of superstar Cary Grant. She ultimately gave in to his persistence. He found her in New York and they began a personal and professional relationship, marrying in 1949 and starring opposite one another in, ironically enough, Every Girl Should Be Married, and in a bit of foreshadowing, Room for One More. Drake more or less retired from acting in the early 50s, and when she visited Grant in Spain on the set of The Pride and Passion, she got the feeling he was having an affair with his co-star Sophia Loren. The upset Drake quickly booked passage back to the US on the Italian ocean liner Andrea Doria, boarding at Gibraltar. There were around 1,100 people and 572 crew members on board the ship when, on the last night of the trip, and hours before they were supposed to dock in New York, the boat was sailing near the coast of Nantucket. The skies that night were so foggy that the MS Stockholm never saw the Andrea Doria in its path. The two ships collided, causing the Andrea Doria to capsize. Drake was in her stateroom reading at the moment of impact, and after feeling the collision, she immediately put on her life vest and headed to an upper deck and evacuated safely. She was among the 1,660 people rescued that night, but 46 people died in the accident. On Friday, November 13, 2015, terrorists associated with ISIS launched a coordinated attack on the city of Paris. At 9:20 p.m., 3 bombs exploded all at once inside the crowded Stade de France sports venue. Elsewhere around the metropolitan area, at almost exactly the same time, 4 shooters opened fire at packed bars and restaurants. The deadliest and most brutal attack of the evening occurred at the Bataclan, a 1,500-seat concert hall hosting a sold-out performance by the hard rock band Eagles of Death Metal. The American group, led by singer Jesse Hughes, was on stage when 3 ISIS gunmen forced their way inside and began to fire into the crowd. Hughes and his bandmates rushed backstage to what they thought was safety, but Hughes found himself face-to-face with a man pointing a gun at him. He later told Sweden's TV4, "I thought I was dead. I just waited for the shots to hit me." Miraculously, he was able to run to safety. But elsewhere in the club, Eagles of Death Metal merch organizer Nick Alexander was shot and killed along with 3 representatives of the band's record label.
It was such a long attack that I don't think anyone thought they were getting out of there alive.
Across all 6 terrorist assaults, 352 people were injured and 130 died. 89 of those deaths came at the Eagles of Death Metal show.
You remember where you were and what the day was like, the weather, the blue skies.
Chef luminary Michael Lamonaco attracted crowds to Le Cirque and the 21 Club before he took over as culinary director at Windows on the World in 1997. An upscale restaurant with an impeccable reputation and impressive views, Windows on the World was located on the 106th and 107th floors of the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Lamonaco reported for work on the morning of September 11, 2001 as usual. But that morning, he was earlier than expected, arriving around 8:30, so he decided to get his broken eyeglasses fixed at an optometry office in the WTC's shopping mall. He was waiting for the repair to be complete at 8:46 a.m. when there was a deafening crash all around him. Speaking to Market Watch, Lamonaco recalled, "I just thought, could that be the subway?" It turns out it was the impact of the first plane. Lamonaco quickly exited the building as debris fell from high in the towers, very near the location of Windows on the World. He decided to head back inside to help evacuate his employees and was on the way when the second plane hit the South Tower. Lamonaco remembered, "I heard the roar of the jet engines. I looked up at the moment of impact." Following her 1996 divorce from Prince Andrew, Sarah Ferguson devoted herself to working with nonprofit groups and charities. She helped form one such group, Chances for Children, which kept an office on the 101st floor of New York City's World Trade Center. Ferguson was due at her organization's headquarters for an 8:45 a.m. meeting on September 11, 2001. She was running late that morning. Her car pulled up to the building at about 8:47 a.m., mere seconds after American Airlines Flight 11 slammed into the North Tower. Chances for Children staff may very well have died that day had they been in the office and not in the lobby waiting to receive Ferguson. When she arrived, she ushered the employees into her car and they all fled to safety.